I came home early, and what I found shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. Betrayed in the most personal way, I walked away from it all, but starting over is harder when the past refuses to let go. When David arrived home earlier than expected, he was greeted by sounds that were unsettlingly familiar but completely out of place. He hadn't planned to come home early, he was just there, by chance. Stepping through the front door, he froze for a moment before continuing inside. "David, wait, don't do this," a voice called out from deeper in the house. Unmoved by the desperate plea, David pressed forward, his steps deliberate. The source of the voice, Brian, instinctively backed away as David entered the room. Without hesitation, David grabbed Brian by his thinning hair and yanked him backward. "I should destroy you," David said quietly, his voice low and controlled as his gaze bore into Brian. "You can't touch me. I'll have you in court so fast your head will spin," Brian stammered, trying to sound confident but failing miserably. "Do you even know who I am?" David's tone didn't waver. He didn't yell and angry, his voice only grew softer, more dangerous. "Lift your chin." Brian hesitated, his bravado faltering. "You're making a huge mistake," he spat, attempting to regain control. "I'll sue you into the ground." "Do you think I care?" David asked coldly. Brian, thinking he could intimidate his way out, raised his chin defiantly. But the smug look on his face quickly dissolved as David's fist connected, once, twice, and then again, with calculated precision. "Oh my God, David, what have you done?" Clara's voice cut through the tension, breaking the silence that followed the blows. She stood in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth in shock. David turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I've got plenty of questions for you, Clara," he said, his voice still eerily calm. "But now's not the time. I need to leave before I do to you what I just did to him." His words hung in the air, quiet but sharp as a blade. "David, please." Clara's voice wavered as she tried to reason with him. "Do you even know who he is?" David didn't pause. "I'll tell you what I told him, do you think I care?" His eyes shifted briefly toward the hallway. "How could you, Clara? In our bed?" Her protests continued as David walked out, ignoring her cries for him to stop and talk. He slammed the door behind him, got into his truck, and drove aimlessly until he pulled into a liquor store. Inside, he grabbed a bottle of bourbon, then parked in the Walmart lot, drinking straight from the bottle while watching traffic pass by. His phone buzzed repeatedly, Clara's name lighting up the screen. He ignored the calls and texts until they became relentless. Finally, he answered. "What?" he said curtly. "David, where are you?" "Please come home so we can talk," Clara pleaded. "We need to work through this." "It's over," David replied flatly. "Over? You mean with Brian?" "He's gone." He woke up furious and stormed out. "That's good to hear," David said dryly. "Did you enjoy him again?" "How could you even ask me that?" Clara's voice cracked with desperation, but David interrupted her. "I can't believe I married someone like you." "Don't call me again," he said before hanging up. Tossing the phone aside, he turned his focus back to the bourbon. The next morning, David woke up stiff and aching from a night spent in his truck. His head throbbed, and he desperately needed coffee and a bathroom. He returned to Walmart, bought a clean pair of jeans and a shirt, and changed in the truck before heading to work. By the time he arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m., his phone was flooded with 37 messages, 20 emails, and 3 missed calls, all from Clara. When his coworker Mike walked into the office, he stopped short, waving a hand in front of his nose. "What is that smell? Did you bathe in bourbon or something?" David forced a weak smile. "Rough day yesterday." "Rougher night." Mike frowned. "Whatever it was, if Clara finds out you came in smelling like that, she's gonna lose it." "Clara can go to hell," David muttered, leaning back in his chair. His eyes met Mike's. "You've never done anything like that, have you?" Mike blinked, unsure of what to say. "You're kidding, right?" "I did what you told me to, right before you tore my head off," Mike said cautiously, his voice low. "What's going on?" David rubbed his temple, his frustration evident. "I got back early, that's what happened. And I found her in my bed." "My bed?" Mike's face fell. "Are you sure?" David's expression hardened as he showed his bruised hand, still aching from the earlier confrontation. "I stood in the doorway, Mike. Took one look, and, yeah, I'm sure." Mike shifted uneasily. "Did you handle it? Let's just say he won't forget me anytime soon." Mike's voice lowered. "Who was it? Someone from her office?" "He wasn't answering questions when I left," David said, his tone sharp. After a pause, Mike ventured, "Did you destroy him?" David shook his head. "No. He's coming after me now, that bald idiot. Said he'd sue me." Mike sighed. "Might have been better if you had. A crime of passion's one thing, but now it's premeditated. You're screwed." "I know." David's voice cracked, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. "I loved her, Mike. Why? Why would she do this?" His voice was anguished, his eyes glistening. "I gave her everything, loved her more than I thought I could ever love anyone. Why?" A single tear rolled down his cheek, and Mike hesitated before asking softly, "Have you asked her why?" David shook his head firmly. "No. I don't want to talk to her." Mike sighed. "You'll never get answers if you don't, you know." "I know." David's voice broke. "But I don't want to know. Not really. Screw this. I need to disappear." "Disappear?" Mike asked, alarmed. "David, we worked so hard for this, building the company, the office, everything. Don't just throw it away. I can't afford to buy you out, Anne." "We'll figure something out," David interrupted. "I'm getting on a boat this afternoon." "A boat? What are you talking about? Where are you even going?" "I won't know until I get there," David replied curtly. "I'll call you when I figure it out. Keep paying my salary while I work remotely. If it gets unfair, we'll renegotiate. I'll keep designing from the boat and send you the account info for direct deposit when I'm settled." Without waiting for a reply, David gathered what he needed, left the office, and drove to the bank. He set up a new account and grabbed a starter checkbook, leaving a note for Mike before heading to the marina. The docks buzzed with activity as David reached his 33-foot Grady White yacht. Its sleek design, 11.5-foot beam, and upgraded 560-gallon fuel tank gave it power and range, while the Yamaha 350 engines ensured speed. He leaned back at the helm, staring at the GPS screens and running calculations, fuel consumption, provisions, and distances. His planned route was ambitious: Virginia Beach, Charleston, Jacksonville, Cape Canaveral, Fort Lauderdale, and finally Nassau. At a couple hundred miles per day, he estimated a week or two to reach the Bahamas, depending on the weather. A storm brewing in the Gulf might delay him, but he hoped it would veer north. The planning distracted him from the raw ache in his chest. He needed to leave quickly, fearing that Clara might find him before he could escape. Once at sea, the isolation would give him time to face the loneliness, and the dangers, of solo travel. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. Clara. Again. Letting the call go to voicemail, he glanced at the message. "You have to talk to me. Don't just walk away from us." Fury bubbled up. Don't walk away from us. Had she thought of that when she was in bed with Brian? Unable to hold back, he called her. "David. Where are you?" "I've been worried sick all night and all day," Clara answered immediately, her voice desperate. "It doesn't matter where I am," David said coldly. I want answers. David, please, just come home. Let's talk. Don't give up on us. Us? David's voice was sharp, laced with venom. You already gave up, remember? Our bed, Clara. Our bed. That was a mistake. Clara pleaded. It didn't mean anything. David's jaw tightened as he ended the call without another word. The yacht's engines roared to life, and with one final glance at the marina, he turned toward the open sea, leaving the shore, and Clara, behind. I should have trusted my gut instead of my heart, David muttered as he leaned against the railing of his boat, staring at the endless expanse of water. Now I'm completely screwed. Meanwhile, back at her office, Clara sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on a photo of David. In it, he was tanned and beaming, holding up a massive fish from one of his countless fishing trips. David was always either traveling for work or fishing. She'd tagged along a few times, but the places he frequented, small towns like Mountain Home, Arkansas, or Monroeville, Alabama, weren't her idea of fun. The last trip they took together had been to the oil fields up north, and she swore it would be the last time she joined him. Clara, her boss called, pulling her attention back to the present. We've got an interesting case being fast-tracked. It's a land deal that needs city approval. You'd have to put in some serious overtime. Are you interested? She straightened in her chair. Sounds intriguing. Where's it located? Just outside D.C., in Maryland, her boss explained. The zoning's all set. We just need city approval. It's going to take a lot of time and effort. What do you think? Clara nodded, a determined expression on her face. I'm in. Sounds like a challenge. At first, the late nights on the project were strictly professional. Then, they started turning into dinners with Brian, a colleague she had worked with for years. It began innocently enough, a quick bite at a deli, then a nice restaurant. But one evening, the line between friendly and inappropriate blurred. One decision led to another, and before she knew it, Clara had crossed a line she could never uncross. The next morning, she woke up beside Brian and immediately felt the crushing weight of guilt. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This can't happen again. Come on, Clara, Brian said, his voice smooth. You enjoyed it. You can't deny that. Shut up, Brian, she snapped, her voice trembling. I mean it. This can't happen again. But Brian didn't back down. Now that I've had you, Clara, I'm not sure I can work alongside you without wanting more. This could get complicated. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at him. What do you want from me? I love my husband. If David ever found out, he'd destroy us both. One more time, Brian said with a confident smirk. Then maybe I'll think about letting this go. When Brian finally left, Clara buried her face in her hands. You, David, she whispered to the empty room. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? Her mind wandered back to conversations she'd had with David in the past. Why wasn't I at least a 9? She'd once joked with him. Maybe a 10 when I smile. David had laughed and pulled her close. Don't talk like that, he'd said. You're everything I could ever want. I'd follow you anywhere, Clara. You're my world. She had laughed with him then, feeling safe and loved. Now those memories felt like cruel reminders of what she had thrown away. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from Jimmy, David's best friend. His tone was sharp and demanding. David, where are you? What have you done? Clara's been calling me non-stop. She's in pieces. I haven't done anything, David replied flatly. Go home, Jimmy. Don't take sides until you know the whole story. You're acting like a teenager, David. Jimmy snapped. She wants more from you than just weekends together. You've been gone for so long, you know that. David's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "Jimmy, don't lecture me. I'm going away for a while. I'll call you when I'm ready." "Why, David? Why now? Why her?" Jimmy asked, his frustration palpable. David stared out at the horizon, his jaw tight. After a long pause, he finally said, "Because I thought what we had was real. Turns out, I was wrong." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the deck. The roar of the boat's engines drowned out the silence as David turned toward the open sea. The vast water stretched ahead, a place to escape the pain, though he knew the memories would follow him wherever he went. "I see guys chasing her all the time," David said, shaking his head. "Why me? You're good-looking, funny, smart, and, let's be real, great at kissing," Clara's friend Becky teased with a laugh. "You should open a kissing booth." David chuckled despite himself. "Fine, I'll call her. But if we're talking, it has to mean something. I'm not into casual games." Becky grinned. "Please do. She's moping because she hasn't heard from you. Does she know phones work both ways?" "She could have called me," David retorted. Becky shot him a glare. "You know how she is. Just call her." David eventually met Clara at the sorority house. She had hurt her ankle playing tennis, and her wince gave away the pain. "Does it hurt to move?" he asked, crouching down to inspect it. "It's not swollen. Can you put any weight on it?" Clara winced as she tried. "Not much. Let me get you to the ER, David said, scooping her into his arms. After the doctor diagnosed it as a mild sprain, David carried her to his apartment, gently placing her on the bed to rest. The memory of her smile as she looked up at him lingered as David navigated the waves later that week, tears threatening to escape as he thought about everything that had gone wrong. After refueling his boat that evening, David docked for the night and set up a folding chair on the deck. He sat there with a bottle of whiskey, staring out at the horizon and trying to make sense of the mess his life had become. The next morning, the hangover was too much, so he stayed docked instead of sailing further. His phone buzzed relentlessly, but he ignored it until finally picking it up. The expression on Clara's face when they'd last spoken flashed through his mind, and he knew everything had changed. They'd promised exclusivity, but Clara had shattered that. When they first met again, it had been at a party. David had been introduced to Tim, who had extended a hand, smiling. "Hi, I'm Tim." David didn't return the handshake. "Sure, good to meet you," he said flatly, his eyes turning to Clara. "Maggie," he said, his voice tight. "Good to see you." Then he turned and walked away, his fists clenched at his sides. "David, wait." Clara called after him. "Sorry," he said, his back to her. "I don't have time." Clara watched him go, torn inside. She'd been planning to break things off with Tim but hadn't done it yet. Tim's face twisted in confusion as he asked, "Who was that?" "That was David," Clara admitted, her voice heavy. "I was going to talk to you about him." "What happened?" Tim pressed. She looked down. "I told you I was ending things with him, but I said it would take time." "Did you sleep with him?" Tim's voice grew sharp. "Why are you asking me that?" Clara's tone rose defensively. "No, I didn't sleep with him, not this time." She paused before adding, "You know I'm not a maid here to clean up everything." Tim leaned back, stunned into silence. Clara turned away from him, still replaying David's departure. She hadn't explained everything to the people around her yet, not really. "I've called Sid and Jimmy," she told Tim. "But David's barely reached out to them. He only called Jimmy once. Sid hasn't heard from him at all. So, to them, David just left for no reason?" Tim asked. "Do you really think they won't wonder if something's wrong? If David did something?" His voice softened. "Are you willing to let them think that and say nothing? Clara, you don't deserve him. You know that, right? Her heart sank at Tim's words, but she said nothing. The weight of her choices and their consequences pressed down on her like an anchor she couldn't shake. I was good. I just stumbled, Clara said defensively. Stumbled? Becky shot her an incredulous look. You make it sound like you slipped on a banana peel. Clara, you slept with him, in David's bed. What were you thinking? Clara didn't respond, her gaze dropping to her hands as she fidgeted. Becky sighed, shaking her head. What are you going to do now? Out on the open water, David adjusted the lines on his boat, explaining the bait tank system to Sarah, a young woman from a nearby boat who had approached him hesitantly. The water in the tank overflows back into the ocean, keeping it fresh and oxygenated. That way, the bait stays alive longer. Sarah tilted her head, watching him closely. That was nice, she said softly. What was nice? David asked, glancing up. The way you explained it, Sarah replied. Not like I was stupid. Most people talk down to me. Thank you. You're welcome, David replied with a small nod. I don't talk much, usually. I noticed, Sarah said with a shy laugh. Can I come aboard? Just to take a look. Sarah, David hesitated, scanning her face. Can I help you with something? You don't seem like you're here just to chat about bait tanks. Sarah sighed, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. I'm trying to fix my pump so I can go fishing. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you. My parents thought swimming here would cheer me up. She laughed, but it was a bittersweet sound, tinged with sadness. Her dazzling white teeth stood out against her sun-kissed skin, and her soft green eyes shimmered in the afternoon light. What's wrong with that? Sounds like they care about you, David said, leaning back against the railing. They do, Sarah admitted. But it's complicated. My parents have been in love forever, even after their divorce. Now I'm stuck living on a boat with them, and it's constant reminders of what I'll never have. I love them, but it's hard. A tear slid down her cheek. I'm sorry to dump this on you. I should go. Sarah, wait, David said quickly, his voice softening. Don't go. I understand more than you think. Sarah paused, studying him curiously. David shifted uncomfortably, trying to make sense of her situation. She can't be old enough to carry all this weight, he thought. I'm almost 30, David, Sarah said as if reading his mind. David blinked, startled. It doesn't seem fair for someone your age to feel this way. The next day, Sarah introduced David to her parents. David, this is my mom, Beth Livingston, and my dad, Ben. Beth smiled warmly, looking like an older version of Sarah. Hi, David. Thanks for meeting us, she said. Sarah told us you sail, Ben added, extending a hand. His eyes studied David carefully, though his smile didn't quite reach them. I grew up sailing a 32-foot Nicholson yacht with my father. It's been years since I've been on the water, but I'm hoping to take the boat out tomorrow. David nodded. I'd be happy to help if you need it. Beth smiled. We don't want to impose, but Sarah mentioned you're experienced. It would mean a lot to Ben. Ben and Beth spent some time asking David questions, clearly testing his sailing knowledge. Satisfied with his answers, they made plans for the next day. The following afternoon, David and Ben stood together at the helm, navigating the yacht with ease. The sails were lowered as they approached the marina. David docked the boat smoothly, securing the ropes and shutting off the engine. That was fun, Ben said, his silver hair ruffling in the wind. Thanks for a great day. It brought back some good memories. Thank you, sir, David replied. Would you mind taking us out again this week? Ben asked hopefully, his eyes lighting up. I'd love to, David said. But I'll need to adjust my schedule. Can I call you back? Of course, Ben said with a nod. Just let us know. I know Sarah would love it. I'll love it too, David replied with a small smile. Are you all set, or do you need help washing the boat? No, I've got it, Ben said. Thanks again. David stepped off the dock and headed back to his yacht. As he climbed aboard, his phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with missed calls and voicemails, all from Clara. I've been trying to reach you, one message read. Why won't you answer? David sighed, setting the phone back down. He wasn't ready to talk to her yet. Not now. Maybe not ever. I haven't turned it on yet, David said into the phone. But I'll call you every day at 3 o'clock unless I'm out fishing. If I'm on the water, I'll call when I get back. David and Bob spent over an hour on the phone discussing various projects, equipment issues, maintenance schedules, startup plans, and personnel matters. It was a normal conversation, but when David hung up, the weight of his reality hit him again. Later, his phone buzzed. It was Jimmy. Dad, where are you? This isn't funny anymore. Mom's furious. She calls me every day, and Sid's been reaching out too. What the hell is going on? Ask Sid, David replied curtly. What's Sid got to do with this? What's going on, Dad? Jimmy pressed. I don't want to get into it, David said flatly, ending the conversation. The next morning, Sarah greeted David brightly as he stumbled groggily into the galley. David, get up. I've got eggs and bacon for you, she teased. He rubbed his eyes and groaned. You're way too cheerful this morning. Can you dim the sun? It's too damn bright. Sarah laughed. You did better last night than I expected. David winced. Yeah, about last night. Was I an idiot? If I was, I'm sorry. Sarah placed a plate of food in front of him. You told me I was beautiful and that you loved me. If you meant it, then fine. If not, then yeah, you were an idiot. David froze, his face turning red. Oh, I didn't mean to, I mean, yeah, you're beautiful, but Sarah burst out laughing. Relax, David. I'm kidding. Then she added with a smirk, but I am going to make you talk to me this morning. As they ate, the conversation turned more serious. Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. If she was really that far above you, David, she must have been stunning. But don't forget, she's a cheater. David nodded grimly. It's over. Absolutely. I'm sorry, Sarah said softly. I don't know what to say. I'm not going to throw clichés at you, like how time will heal everything or how there are other fish in the sea. I know it just hurts. Thanks, David said quietly. A tear slid down his cheek, and Sarah reached out to squeeze his hand before leaving him to his thoughts. A week later, David returned to the office. David! Bob exclaimed, greeting him warmly. It's good to see you. The clients have been asking for you, they want you to help with the St. Louis launch. Can you go for a week or two? I need to see a lawyer first, David said. I need to sort out my finances and figure out what else needs to be done. Bob frowned, placing a hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? My head's clear, Bob, David admitted. But emotionally, I'm dead. At the lawyer's office, David sat across from the attorney, his expression stony. I want a divorce, he said bluntly. Can you prepare the papers, or tell me who can? I also need to deal with the police, I think I'm wanted for assault. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, considering. Let me make a few calls. Can you wait outside? I think we can use this situation to your advantage. She should be fired for misconduct, and that might prevent her from claiming your share. David nodded silently and stood, walking to the waiting area. Each step felt heavy, but for the first time in days, he sensed a flicker of control returning to his life. I didn't take pictures, David admitted, rubbing his temples. So it's my word against theirs. I'm not sure if infidelity charges will stick. Okay, Tim replied, leaning back in his chair. Let's get Mary and George involved. They're good. But I need to ask, how will you afford this? What's your fee situation? David sighed. I'll figure something out. In court, the judge's gavel banged. You are free to go, the judge declared. Yes, Your Honor, Tim replied. As they exited the courtroom, George muttered, My God, she smiled. I've never seen her smile before. She seemed nice to me, David remarked dryly. George snorted. She's never been called nice, more like, Hang Harriet. That'll be interesting. The next day, a courier arrived at David's door with a letter. It was his termination papers, stating that the partnership was dissolved on moral grounds due to his arrest and pending charges. Stunned but resigned, David took the letter to Tim's office and tossed it onto his desk. Tim glanced at it and sighed. Now what? He asked. David shook his head. Now there's nothing left to do but move on. Later, David was surprised when Clara walked into his office. She looked as beautiful as she had in college, though time had added a few extra pounds and her red, puffy eyes told their own story. David, she said softly. He didn't stand as she approached. No hugs, she asked with a strained smile. No, David said coldly. You're so distant. We've spent 30 years together, Clara began, her voice trembling. You had fun with another man in my bed, David said flatly. How many times? How long? It was only once, Clara insisted. David, it was a mistake. You expect me to believe that? David asked, his voice sharp. I don't, Clara admitted, tears streaming down her face. It just happened. David's expression darkened. You make it sound like you slipped on a banana peel. Please, Clara pleaded, her voice cracking. David, I'm so sorry. What have I done? I've ruined this family. You have, David said bluntly. And I don't believe you anymore. David, please. Believe me. It was just one time. We came home from the bar, and it happened. David's anger flared. You slept with him in my bed. The most intimate, vulnerable thing a person can do, and you did it in my bed. I'm sorry, David, Clara sobbed. I can't even explain how sorry I am. I can't deal with this right now, David said, standing. I'm leaving. Don't call me. Don't write me. Deal with the boys. If they call me, I'll know you took responsibility. I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk. At the office, David sat with Bob and Tim, discussing next steps. I can't believe it, Bob said, shaking his head. I've never seen her go easy on anyone before. PBJ for assault is rare. How will this affect our plans? How do we protect the business from Clara? David asked, his tone resigned. John, just go back to work, Bob advised. If you don't, we might not have a business left to protect. David nodded slowly. What if I go back as an employee, not a partner? When this is over, Bob can promote me back to partner. That might work, Tim said. Let me review the partnership agreements and see what provisions we can use. At home, David sat with his son, Sid, who wasn't holding back. Dad, I have bills to pay, a mortgage, and I can't just walk away from everything. What do I do now? Sid asked. David frowned. Unless this guy meant nothing to her, she's made her choice. Sid shook his head in frustration. Mom, are you ready to leave the family for him? Because if not, the family will leave you. Sid, why are you being so rude? Clara interjected, her voice trembling. Because I didn't screw up, Mom. You did, Sid snapped. Clara's face crumpled. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice breaking. I really screwed up, didn't I? No one answered, but the silence was deafening. Maggie hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, tears silently streaming down her face. She stayed there, motionless, until the house was bathed in darkness. Eventually, she moved to the bedroom and lay down, her thoughts spiraling. Why is everyone so angry? She thought bitterly. It was just one mistake. Tears welled up again as the weight of her actions pressed harder and harder. Thank you, Jose, but I don't want to inconvenience your family, David said hesitantly. Jose smiled his familiar crooked smile. You won't bother us, my friend. You'll stay with us, he said with finality. David nodded. All right. Thank you. Jose's house was simple, a sturdy cinderblock structure with a tin roof. The uphill drive to get there had been a welcome relief for David, putting physical distance between him and the wreckage of his life. Inside, the house was dim but meticulously tidy, with a bead curtain separating the main room from the back. As David stepped inside, an angry woman's voice rang out from behind the curtain. Jose sighed and rolled his eyes. Don't mind her, he muttered before disappearing behind the beads, leaving David standing awkwardly in the main room. That night, the storm came. Though not as strong as predicted, it knocked out the power. David tried to sleep on the couch, but his thoughts churned relentlessly. Eventually, Hermosa, Jose's sister, emerged from behind the curtain. She gestured for him to sit up and made room for herself on the couch. Without speaking, Hermosa leaned against David's shoulder. He hesitated but eventually put his arm around her. They sat in silence as the storm raged outside, her breathing evening out as she fell asleep. David, however, stayed awake, staring into the darkness and replaying the events that had brought him here. The next morning, Jose approached David. We've got a sunken boat at the marina that needs salvaging. Can you help? David nodded. Of course. Let's get to it. They found the equipment they needed and worked together to secure airbags and run straps under the sunken boat. The ancient compressor sputtered but held, and by nightfall, they had pumped out the water and raised the boat. The marina looked much better. Thank you, David, Jose said, pulling him into a hug. Are you coming with me? No, David replied. I'll stay on the down deep. Please thank Hermosa for everything. That evening, David was startled to see Clara walking toward him at the marina. He froze as she approached. I'm glad to see you, she said softly. I don't know where to stay yet. The hotels aren't all open. I came straight from the airport. David crossed his arms. What are you doing here, Clara? I thought I'd never see you again, Clara admitted, her voice trembling. I couldn't bear the thought of you out here needing help without me. David's expression hardened. So now you care, he asked, his voice cold. You thought this would fix everything? Clara's eyes filled with tears. David, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come. After a long pause, David softened slightly. Clara, the time we spent together meant everything to me. But you broke that. There's no fixing it now. She wiped at her cheek and nodded. I'll go back to the airport, Clara said quietly. As Clara began to leave, Jose appeared with a tray of iced tea and offered it to Clara, David, and Hermosa, who had joined them. Jose's sister looked between Clara and David, sensing the tension. Hi, Hermosa said gently. You're Clara, aren't you? You're just like David described. Clara's shoulders sagged as a tear rolled down her cheek. I hope we can at least be friends, she said quietly. Hermosa extended a hand. I hope so too. Take care of him, Clara. He deserves better than what he's been through. Clara hesitated before shaking Hermosa's hand. She glanced at David one last time. You're a lucky woman, she said, her voice breaking, before turning and walking away.